Why don't we begin first? Hello, everybody. Hello, in particular, Michael and Orin and Will. Gentlemen, why don't you identify yourselves for the benefit of people who maybe haven't read you, but probably most of them haven't seen you. So, Michael, you want to start? Let's do it in alphabetical order by last name. Michael.
Sure. So I'm a law professor. I'm a law professor at George Washington, and Eugene and I got to know Eugene when I was a professor at George Mason. Eugene visited there briefly. And I just recently started blogging, and just in time for this pandemic. And so I've been writing a little bit about it, and happy to talk about some of that as we move along.
What are your fields? Not just pandemic related, but generally.
Sure. Yeah, so I write on law and economics. I do some work on intellectual property. A lot of my scholarship focuses on differences in how legal institutions and markets aggregate and act on information. I think markets tend to act on information a lot faster, and so one of the questions in law is how can we harness markets for decision making? How can we make legal institutions more like markets? And so that's some of what I've been talking about lately. Well,
that sounds excellent, but the important question is, what are you drinking?
I'm actually just, I'm on the East Coast here, so I can't, this is way past my bedtime already. I'm just basically drinking some water.
That's
you told me to bring a drink, so I brought one, but.
Oh, all right, well, that's
there we go. But I got
how much?
I got one glass, so you exposed me though.
So that's good. Michael, welcome. Will.
I'm Will Baude. I teach at the University of Chicago. I teach law and federal courts and conflict of laws, one of my favorites. I think I've known Eugene since I was a college student, and I was reading his blog in 2002 or 2003, and then thought it'd be pretty cool to start blogging myself. So I started my own blog, and then eventually lucked into getting on the Eugene's
blog. And what was that blog called?
It was called Crescat Sententia, which is a very bad Latin pun.
I never actually translated it, so what that means.
The motto of the University of Chicago is Crescat Scientia Vita Excalator, let knowledge grow more numerous and life will be enriched. So Crescat Sententia was a relatively uneducated attempt to translate let opinions grow more numerous.
Oh, well, there you
for her blog. I'm actually not sure whether it's good Latin or not.
Yeah, well, that's the way things are for a lot of us with our Latin. So that's good. And tell us your fields.
Constitutional law, federal courts, and conflict of laws.
Nice. And for the benefit of people who don't actually know what federal courts means as a field.
Federal courts is sort of some people would call it constitutional law for lawyers. I would call it the union of constitutional theory and civil procedure. What are the jurisdiction and powers of the federal courts?
That's an excellent way of putting it. And note what you did not say. You didn't say, oh, for the benefit of people who don't know what federal courts means, it's kind of things like Younger abstention and Pullman abstention. That would come down. So what are you drinking?
I'm drinking a cocktail, a Boulevardier.
A Boulevardier. That you need to translate that too. So you translate Crescat Sententia, translate federal court.
It's a mix of bourbon, Campari, and vermouth. You know what a Negroni is? It's basically a Negroni with whiskey instead of gin.
Interesting. Well, very good. Orin, to you. Did you mute yourself? You must have muted yourself. So I'll unmute you. No? No, I can't unmute you. Can you? Yeah, good.
There we go. That works.
Good.
So I'm Orin Kerr. I'm a law professor now at the University of California at Berkeley. Used to be at George Washington University, where I was Michael's colleague for many years. And then I was at USC briefly before moving north to Berkeley. And I've been on the blog since 2002, which is kind of amazing. I don't blog as much as I used to, but still do on occasion. And I teach criminal procedure, computer crime law topics, and do a lot of Fourth Amendment law, a lot of Fourth Amendment and new technology. Recently started doing a bunch of Fifth Amendment law too, but criminal procedure, police investigations involving computers is kind of the stuff I like to do the most. And my drink this evening is a Deschutes Obsidian Stout, which is quite excellent.
Mm.
I forgot we were supposed to be drinking, but I mean, I want to go along with the group here. The peer pressure is so much. That
Right. Yeah, exactly. We're driving you to drink.
That's right. It doesn't take too much. But I'm right near my beer fridge, so that makes it easy.
Well, that is excellent. That is excellent. Knowing you as I do, I was pretty confident you would be drinking beer.
I'll take that the right way.
No. Everybody's drinking. You happen to like beer. I remember you sort of waxing poetic about various kinds of beers. That and jazz.
That's true.
Two things that don't really work for me, but I admire enthusiasm. So I am Eugene Volokh. I teach First Amendment law. I also argue a considerable number of cases and brief considerable number of cases through a class that I teach, as well as through other mechanisms, which is one reason I get interested in things like oral argument and other people going to video oral arguments and the like. So I'm actually doing some lawyering, although my career was kind of backward. I did no lawyering basically for the first 14 or so years of my career, and then a considerable amount of appellate since. So my main fields are First Amendment law. I used to teach criminal law and torts and copyright law. I've done a considerable amount of internet law, and I also have taught and written about guns, both on the Second Amendment side. Is the writing, the teaching has been also on the policy side, more as a consumer of policy literature rather than producing. I am drinking Bacardi Black Rum, which is a dark rum, so it's kind of sweet. It's molasses, so I like it, but it's not too sweet. I think it's not liqueur sweet. And I want to send a shout out. By the way, colleagues, you are free to do the same, but I want to send a shout out to Sabrina Lieberman, who's the daughter of Mark Lieberman, who's a lawyer here in LA, who has helped me out tremendously, and her boyfriend Luke Ballestero. I think I may see them in the little corner over there. Excuse me, I think Ballestrero, I realize now, and they are in the cherry capital, Traverse City, Michigan. I happen to know a little bit about Traverse City because I married a Michigander. Although I think if Michigander would be male, so Michigoose maybe should be the female. So in any event, she has relatives in Traverse City. Sometimes when we go for family reunions, we go to Traverse City. So welcome everybody. A great pleasure to have you here. I see about 60 people, which, you know, I've flown places and been happy to talk to 60 people. And this is after airports and taxis and just sneaky kind of. So in any case, great pleasure to have you here. Also, great pleasure to see Orin and Will and Michael, whom I only used to see every so often, and now maybe never again if we're permanently quarantined. So guys, what's up? So let me ask you this question. What is it that you think people aren't talking about that's really important about the law and this whole situation we're finding ourselves in? So don't talk about whether it's okay to shut down large gatherings, including churches. Everybody's talking about that. We can talk about it a little later. But tell us what we should be thinking about that we aren't. While I drink my...
Thinking about, but when I have Orin here, I actually have a Fourth Amendment question for him.
Okay. Go for it.
So, so if you're in a state, like many states that have a sort of a general stay-at-home order and then a list of, 71 things that are exceptions, if the police see you out and about, can they stop you? So on the first day of the Illinois stay-at-home order, the nanny of a friend of ours was driving to her house, and the police just pulled her over and demanded to know where she was going and why she was out and about. And she said, I'm a nanny, and that's a accepted essential service, and so the police let her go. But I did find myself wondering, are they doing that a lot? And is that a suspicionless search and seizure? I assume in general this is going to be relevant to how the police enforce these things. So Orin, what's the answer?
Yeah, I think it depends on how the local ordinance or state law or whatever it is drafted. But the ones I've seen and the one that applies in California is so full of exceptions that I don't think merely seeing a car on the road could be reasonable suspicion to believe there's a violation. And when I go for walks in my neighborhood, there are significant numbers of cars on the road. And I assume that those are people either with essential jobs or doing, you're allowed to drive to a place to do your exercise, or allowed to go get food, or, there are so many exceptions that I think it's highly unlikely that you could just take the fact that a car is on the road as itself reasonable suspicion to believe that the driver is in violation. Is it possible? It's possible, but reasonable suspicion, I think, is higher than that. So in all likelihood, these sorts of stops, if they're occurring, are in violation of the Fourth Amendment. There isn't much of a remedy because we aren't seeing the kinds of facts that are the classic ways that you get into court, which is they pull somebody over because they think they're violating the rules of the quarantine rules, and then they find drugs and it turns into a drug case. My sense is that, no, this is like an actual enforcement of the quarantine rules. The flip side of that is that there are all sorts of standards for when you could have like a checkpoint or some sort of entirely suspicionless stops. But I don't think that would just allow general police discretion to pull anybody over. I don't think you can get to that result. Although there have been interesting questions with like quarantining people coming in from out of state. What if they're out of state plates? That's kind of an interesting question that I'm not totally sure where I come out on yet. But
what about special needs, Orin?
Yeah, so
I just like using these buzzwords. Special needs.
Good buzzword.
Sovereign citizen. No, actually.
You get 5 points on your pro exam for saying
Thank you. Thank you. I spotted the issue, Professor.
Sorry, Eugene. I do not use those kind of metrics. I'm a just gestalt kind of. Weird stating the phrase gets you nothing. So yeah, the special needs exception is basically, what about a non-law enforcement purpose, and does the stop advance the non-law enforcement purpose? And that's how the Supreme Court basically allows checkpoints and the like. I haven't seen, there's certainly emergency circumstances, there's where they'll allow a suspicionless stop, but I haven't seen, I don't think you're going to be able to have like a program where whenever the officer sees a car, he can, at the officer's discretion, stop someone. I think like if it's a checkpoint or some sort of program, that might be okay under special needs. But not just like whenever an officer has to spot a car.
So maybe they kind of
I haven't looked at the cases closely to see, in part because the fact patterns are changing so quickly. With, I guess Rhode Island had its program and then they changed its policy a few days later, and so things are moving so fast. I haven't really closely studied all of them.
But Rhode Island has the advantage of being an island, right? No.
And with a road.
With a road, that's the problem. The roads keep it from being really an island. So all right. So this is a good question. I've been wondering about the same thing myself. Orin, the baton has passed to you since Will has dropped it. So we'll get back to you, Will. So what is it that people should be thinking about?
The part that I'm most interested in is what's the long-term effect of staying at home, psychologically, sort of over time. So we're kind of 2 to 3 weeks in, depending on where you are, maybe shorter, maybe longer, of this remarkable situation that none of us have ever experienced. And I just wonder if we go on for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year or however long this happens, what's the long-term effect on, it's really a psychology question, I think, more than anything else. But I'd love to see good writing on this question, and I have not seen it.
Yeah, great question. Great question. And one question, I suppose, is to what extent do the modern communications help alleviate that, and to what extent they're just inadequate. It does strike me that if this had happened 30 years ago without the internet, certainly a shutdown would have been much, much more painful and much more dislocating. Obviously, this one is tremendously economically dislocated, but more. Although perhaps that means we wouldn't have had a shutdown. We would have just said, okay, fine, people are going to die. Like they have in past pandemics, but obviously there's nothing we can do. Now there is something we can do that's kind of survivable, but maybe not. Maybe it's not really survivable.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that if you go back 30 years ago, or it's interesting to play this game too, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, it
used to happen.
Technology of the era, and it's a completely different experience.
Right.
So I think that's definitely true. But I just wonder how this changes people, and are there sort of predictable stages that, 2 months in, this is how people are going to react, or 6 months in, this is how they'll react.
Right, so one piece of this I'm very curious about is sort of obedience to the law. So I think, at least in Illinois, people have been mostly, as far as I can tell, mostly complying with the ordinance most of the time. There are plenty of cars on the roads, but I don't have a sense that there aren't massive illegal gatherings and so on everywhere. But how long does that last? Is it the case that people will just stay in their houses as long as they're told to? Or does there come a point where people, en masse say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, or develop their own sort of order without law? I do suspect we would not all comply for a year, even if it would be a good idea. And once a certain number of people don't comply, other people won't comply. Right. We'll sort into the kind of the law-abiding people who are scared of getting sick who stay at home, and the freewheeling people who roam the streets. I'm not sure, but
some of us will roam the streets like this. I hope not. Hope it's not that kind of virus. Michael, what about you? What do you think we're not thinking about that we should be thinking about? You got to unmute. You got to unmute yourself.
Michael?
Okay, I'm trying to unmute you, but...
There we go. Okay, there we go. I had, after you unmuted me, I had muted myself, but then I realized I couldn't unmute myself. So now I'll just leave myself unmuted. Hopefully the...
Rightly so.
Hopefully the 6-year-old won't come running downstairs. But anyway, so one thing I'm trying to think about is what about planning for the next pandemic or other kind of emergency? And I think one can't start thinking about this too early because probably in the next year, I imagine there will be some legislation, and after that, we'll more or less. I don't think we're going to forget about this for a long time, but when we think about 9/11, for example, we had the Patriot Act. You don't necessarily have a lot of legislation, thoughtful legislation, 5 years later or 10 years later. Maybe you have a sunset, and then you kind of revisit something. So I think it's not too early to start thinking about what's next. And clearly, one of the big failures here was that we just didn't have enough stuff made in advance. We didn't have enough masks. We didn't have enough ventilators. But of course, we can't just think about this pandemic. We need to think about other things. And I think the obvious approach, of course, and I think you'll see this, is the government's going to spend a little bit more money on some of this preparation. But to me, that's not necessarily the only thing we ought to be thinking about. And one thing we ought to be thinking about is how can we improve our, not just kind of what we have in a big warehouse, kind of what we call this national stockpile, but how can we improve our domestic capacity to produce stuff quickly in an emergency without kind of messing up our existing international trade relationships. And just as maybe we could think of CFIUS as kind of really expanding a lot after lots of concerns about national security. So too, do I think we're going to see a lot of areas where people say, our industry is absolutely critical in the event of an emergency, and therefore we can't have international trade. And of course, some countries that are now cutting us off, I think, may come to regret that because, for example, if you look at India, cutting back, India has a major industry in terms of production of drugs, generic drugs, and so forth. And I have to think in that area, people are going to say, wait a minute, we need to have our own domestic capacity. But we don't necessarily need to make drugs ourselves. We don't necessarily need to be able to make everything we actually consume ourselves. We need to have the ability to ramp up quickly.
Right.
And so one thing I've been thinking, and so you could imagine a huge government program trying to figure that out, and I've been trying to think about how one might do something like that. So you could imagine some kind of stress testing, for example, for domestic production, where you might, a simplified version would be, say, at random times, the government might say, okay, now you have to produce X amount, in the next month, pursuant to some contract, or you lose a lot of money. Give some kind of set of financial incentives for production of things we need produced without getting to the point where everybody suddenly says, oh, everything's an essential industry, which, in some sense it is, from agriculture to everything else, but we don't want this to mean kind of the end of international trade and yet another excuse for protectionism. So trying to balance that, I think, is going to be pretty important in the future.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Will?
So one of the other things on my list is the state separation of powers. We've seen, some at the federal level. We've seen president do some things, and some things we think, oh, we have to go to Congress to get stimulus, et cetera, et cetera. And then, but state governors are just doing whole lot of things, basically on their own. You know, they're issuing all these shutdown orders, they're closing businesses, issuing all sorts of different orders. And none of them, further I can tell, are going to their state legislatures for any kind of, you know, permission or guidance or anything about this. And I think we haven't thought enough about the extent to which the governors actually have the authority to do everything they're doing. You know, each state has its own state constitution, its own statutory regime, its own non-delegation doctrine. At the moment, people just need to all be assuming, oh, the governor, he's in charge, he can do whatever. But I think there are going to be lawsuits soon, and probably time to think about, is there any limit to what, like, Governor Pritzker can do on his own in sort of deciding, you know, how long, what businesses will be closed, and picking and choosing who can be open and closed, or is there some point at which he needs, you know, authorization from another legislature and so on. So at the moment we just should be sort of doing what the governors say, but that's not normally how we think about separation of powers at the federal level.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I should also, since we're doing shout-outs, I see Saber Dance and the Abramowicz file, who I know is not pronounced the Obama file. I knew that from the get-go. So they have a connection to the blog, and I've seen at least the Abramowicz file commenting for well over a decade, I think. So I just wanted to say hello. So yeah, my thought is, I've already blogged about it, but this is probably because I'm married to an insurance lawyer, but it'll be very interesting to see how these things shake out. Obviously, there's force majeure clauses in contracts where the question is whether what the contract means as to when a party can just say, sorry, I'm not performing because it's kind of like an earthquake. It's kind of like a volcano, I suppose. And so it'll be interesting to see. I don't actually know how they'll be interpreted, but I think that'll be very important source of litigation. I hope arbitration. I hope this is the sort of thing that can be taken care of relatively quickly, although not all arbitration can be. And then there's also the business interruption insurance cases that presumably some people do try to get business interruption coverage, and this sounds like a business interruption, but is it covered or is it excluded? If I could just step back a little though, if you think about it, there are many models of dealing with risk. One model is FEMA. If there's really a nationwide emergency, then we're going to have a system, you can call it a bailout, but maybe without a pejorative. One way which we insure ourselves is if something really affects the whole country, the federal government steps in and maybe gives out checks, maybe gives out low interest loans, who knows what. Obviously, a classic example is unemployment compensation, which is in fact often labeled and treated in some measure like insurance. Another way of insuring yourself is buying an insurance policy. Another way of insuring yourself is working out a system of contracts where in theory you're going to be covered or you're going to be exempted from obligation, as the case may be, by these things. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out and how people who before, I don't think we've had this kind of major public health problem in the US, certainly during my lifetime, but probably a good deal longer. So I think a lot of things are underspecified. One interesting question is going forward, it will be more specified, but also, you know, if you're graduating from law school and you want a job category that's going to be in demand, and you can still claim you're an insurance lawyer, let's say. Maybe you took a class, or maybe you're in your about to enter your last year, you want to know what to take insurance law. Highly undersubscribed.
On the insurance question, if I may, my own view is that insurance is very difficult to deal with in this. It's very difficult to have very broad categories of insurance because a lot of the especially with something like business interruption insurance, insurers are very worried about correlated risk. But there are other kinds of vehicles that I think work better for this that we still don't see very much in this country. Things like catastrophe bonds, where if there's a certain kind of catastrophe, the bonds will pay out. And a more tailored kind of form of this you see in some of the work of Robert Schiller, where he suggests that, you know, maybe people, for example, should be buying bonds, or I don't know if he calls them bonds exactly, but certain kinds of financial contracts that would pay out if, for example, people in their profession or people in their geographical area, or maybe the intersection of their geographical area and their profession suddenly have much lower income. So certainly one of the challenges in insurance is the adjudication costs are high. We have to figure out how much you loss. And I think a lot of times people don't want to buy insurance because it's, if you just figure out how much is going to, ex ante to that kind of administrative cost, it's just not worth it from their perspective to buy it.
Maybe right.
So one of the nice things about some of these, kind of derivative type markets is that they can really be administratively much cheaper. He talks about a lot in terms of housing policy, that people should be insuring not so much the price of their house, but they should be buying instruments that will pay them if the housing market in the area where they buy a house goes down in value. There's lots of instruments like that we could be thinking about. I don't know that this is really going to be something that will prompt us to do so. One could imagine, that certain occupations, people talk a lot about the possibility that robots are going to take over certain occupations. Well, that's in theory, insurable, maybe not through an insurance contract, but through some kind of derivative market where the payout depends on whether what happens to the income of people who are in the profession that you chose in general, not your particular income, but people in general. Because if, suddenly a whole industry is out of work, we're going to see something broad, and it's not so expensive to identify. We don't see those contracts. I think that's something really missing in our economic system. It's a little bit of a puzzle to me why we don't see a little bit more of that. Maybe this could be a little bit of an impetus, but I'm not holding my breath that we'll see that happen.
Makes sense. So I should also say this is my second glass, and am I worried about drunk driving? I'm not worried about that. See, there are advantages to lockdown.
You could drive to the grocery store.
Pardon? Well,
You could still drive to the grocery store.
Right, but not tonight. Daniel Rodriguez, I want to say Northwestern, but things move quickly. And for all I know, let's see. Daniel Rodriguez, whom I know as Dano from way back. American operatic tenor. No, that's not him. In any event, Professor Daniel Rodriguez mentions that two big restaurant lawsuits have been filed, one by Thomas Keller of the French Laundry, and it is those are it's over business interruption insurance. So Michael is absolutely right that it may be that insurance is not the right way of dealing with these things. The classic example of insurance is I have a 1 in 100 chance of being injured. Everybody else has that, so let's pool our risks. But if there's a large chance that nothing will happen to any of us, and a small chance that something bad will happen to all of us, that may not be the right, insurance may not be the right tool, but it's the one we've got, and it's the one that our law students, I see a student of mine, Emily Reed, a student of mine, maybe she's brushing up her insurance law resume even as we speak. One of our commenters, Mark Lean, says, isn't this a result of the model state Emergency Health Powers Act? I think that's addressed to you, Will. Well, Will, what about the MSAHEPA? I looked it up, it actually exists. It actually does exist. You may know what he's talking about.
Short answer is probably yes, although there are still all these state constitutional doctrines about, the non-delegation doctrine and other things like that it's part of what makes model state legislation for a scenario like this a little complicated. Maybe it's all fine. Maybe somebody's thought through it, unlike me, and has figured out this is all fine.
Right. So maybe the answer, Will, is working off of your Prescott sententia point. There's a phrase that we know, inter arma silent leges. So during times of war, the laws are silent. Maybe like inter vira. I'm positive I got the ending wrong on that one. Silent leges, or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, it's been long understood, as I understand it, throughout American history, that indeed epidemics have kind of create a law of their own. But you're right, that's usually been with regard to substantive rules.
Right.
Organization of government. And it's an interesting question, how long this is going to last.
Well, and even, if you take the war model, I think the standard model, and people criticize it sometimes, is, okay, for a little while, the courts kind of let stuff happen and are silent.
Right.
But they come in at some point to clean up and to say, at this point, things have got to change a little bit, or the award compensation later, or, so in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln gets to just do a lot of stuff that he isn't necessarily authorized to do while Congress isn't there. But then at some point, the courts start coming in a little bit.
Got it. Okay, so I have a couple of questions, or a comment and a question. I'm going to identify the commenter just in case he would rather not be. Regarding the force majeure clauses, he's saying that hotels appear, at least some hotels, appear to be treating force majeure as applicable, which is to say an exception to certain obligations, only within the period of the state lockdown. 8 weeks in that jurisdiction, 8 weeks so far, obviously, it may well be extended, which is an interesting point that some people have observed, which is that a lot of businesses probably preferred an official government lockdown over just suggestions. Part of the reason might be that they may think it's the right thing to do. Part of it may be they don't want their competitors to steal a march on them. But part of it is an official lockdown may allow them to trigger various kinds of relief from obligations under their contracts. Maybe force majeure, maybe illegality, like no, you're suing me for failing to deliver the goods. It would be illegal for me to deliver the goods. I can't be held liable for that. There was a question. Why did it take a pandemic for us to do a Zoom meeting? So that's the question. To what extent do you think? Because the technology is available. I never even really heard of Zoom. I'd had Skype. It didn't really work for me. I hear Skype is considered kind of like Flintstones running in the car or something these days. I may be completely wrong on that. But this is the question. To what extent do you think that people will start saying, wait a minute, why are we having this conference when we should have a Zoom conference, which is basically costs nothing, as opposed to tens of thousands of dollars for travel costs, and has minimal hassle, and obviously has some costs. It's not as immediate, it's not as personal, you can't have dinner together, but has benefits, which is more people could show up who otherwise couldn't fly out. Second question is, do you think we're going to see a lot more appellate, at least, arguments, or maybe even motions arguments in trial court by video? People now know how to do it, and they figure, that's fine. And if you don't get the edge provided by your lawyerly charisma, that you can kind of hold the judges in the palm of your hand, to the extent there is such a thing, and it's not clear there is, it's not even like that's a good from the perspective of the legal system. And the last question, which I think the answer is most likely to be no to this, but one possibility is, are we going to see a lot more actual long distance classes?
Yeah. So just quick. So I had been to Zoom meetings before this. I'm on the board of a nonprofit.
Well, that's because you're so cutting edge.
Must be. And there are some things where I thought I have to do this, but I don't want to travel for it. So I call in, and Zoom is the way to do it. And when I clerked in the circuit 12 years ago, 1 day a week, the arguments were almost all done by video.
I'm sorry, which circuit?
The 10th Circuit.
10th Circuit, interesting. Large, huge geographic.
It was usually the day. There would be a day when all the criminal cases from one state were up for argument, and so the defense attorney, usually the public defender, and the U.S. attorney in, say, Wyoming. I think it was a budgetary thing.
Mm-hmm.
Be in there, in some courthouse in Wyoming together, and would video conference in to Denver, where the 10th Circuit heard arguments. And it was not very good. But I think it remained a thing people did. I would just say my prediction, this is true of the classes too, is that in general, this will set back the cause of doing everything by video conference rather than it. Partly, like the teaching version, I think many people will find that their Zoom classes taught by professors who were not anticipating teaching class by Zoom and taken by students who were not anticipating taking classes by Zoom won't be maybe what they would have been had everybody planned to do that, sometime in advance. And we will so crave human contact whenever we're all released from our prison that for a while, there'll be a sort of an anti-Zoom attitude.
Very possible.
That's my prediction. We're not testing this under the conditions most designed to make it thrive. But you've written the article about this, so.
Well, I wrote an article about virtual reality. By the way, I should say, I want to make sure that people realize that VR is going to be better. One day it's going to be better. But yeah, Mark Lemley and I co-wrote this article on law, virtual reality, and augmented reality. And one of the things that our premise is that in a few years, we don't know just when, but when you've got really lifelike avatars You're going to be able to go to a virtual conference and it feels like you're in a conference, unless you actually want to hug people, in which case you can't, but I'm not a hugger. So that's, that I think would be great, but it's true, the current video technology, not great, not optimal in many ways. Question is it good enough?
What about Barbary? What percentage of students are taking Barbary by just doing the video these days? Because to me, that's sort of the real market test. I mean,
right, market discipline there, no doubt.
I think they are. I think it's more or less the same price. That maybe somebody else can inform us here. It's been a long time since I had to take it, but I think the price is pretty similar. And my understanding, just from talking to students, but I haven't done any systematic survey, is that most people prefer the video. So, you know, the other thing, of course, is that lectures can be done better on video, especially if you have, you know, you actually put some, you know, a lot of people together to make clever animations and things like that. So I don't think we're going to survive. I think we will survive in the classroom, but it's not because we're actually better than the video. It's because credentialing of education and students want to meet one another, network, and so forth. I think information can be conveyed just as well.
You don't think people feel more pressure to pay attention to real persons? I just did my first, I was a audience member for my first Zoom workshop today. A wonderful speaker and a wonderful paper. But I will say, you know, I did notice that it's easier to think, do I really have to be paying attention right now, and not feel the same kind of pressure to like ask a question and those kinds of things when it's just a voice there on the computer.
And Will, that's exactly why I think all faculty meetings should now be on Zoom.
Yes.
Boy, that is a big improvement.
We don't have faculty.
You only want to pay 20% attention. Zoom is perfect as compared to actually being in the room where, you know, you're going to be, am I going to look at my phone? Well, my colleagues are going to see me look at my phone and they might judge me poorly. As Michael knows, that never stopped me.
That didn't stop you yet. Orin was the only one with the laptop in the faculty meeting, but I soon followed, so.
but nonetheless, and I'm a little more optimistic than Will is on this question. I think the experience of using video will give us a good idea of what it's good for, and it'll help us make the cost-benefit decision in a more informed way. And I suspect there are certain things which we will find, oh, actually, this is pretty useful on video, and that is better in some ways. One example of this, I think, you know, people who are spread out all around the country, where you might have an in-person meeting because there's enough people that are in like DC or something like that, where they'll say, well, we'll do that, and then you can call in if you're not in DC. And calling in is often hard because you can really not tell what's going on. But moving those meetings to Zoom can be really useful because then everybody's on the same playing field. And you can actually get a lot of, if it's a substantive interaction that matters, you can do that, I think, most effectively on these sort of video formats. So I think it'll be a useful experience and we'll do more of it. But I don't think it'll replace in-person meetings, especially in an academic setting.
So let me just mention, Dano Rodriguez says, UCLA's fabled 5-hour faculty meetings might finally break the internet. Yes, we did have a 5-hour faculty meeting by Zoom. Yes, probably we wouldn't have had it non-Zoom. We've had long ones, but I think Zoom makes it less painful and actually makes it longer there. It takes more than that to break the internet, thank God. So I think that's very helpful. So what else are people missing in focusing on kind of all the usual things that everybody's been focusing on?
You know, one thing I was actually wondering, I mean, this is a little bit of a segue, but I was wondering whether the internet would break. I mean, not break, but whether we would, you know, would we really have the capacity to suddenly do all these simultaneous video conferences? And of course, we might ask similar questions about things like hospital beds and the like. And of course, we're still worried about that. But you know, it's an interesting graphic I think yesterday that said, well, apparently we're doing much better than Europe in terms of the video conferencing because we actually have a lot more internet capacity, and maybe we have more competition, and maybe sometimes the redundancy associated with competition actually makes it ironically more expensive. It's not always the case that the more competition is cheaper when you have high fixed costs of production. But certainly in an emergency, it turns out to be useful. And I've seen a lot of different figures, and I'm not quite sure I know the answer to how many ICU beds per capita we have versus other countries. And we probably have fewer than we ought to as a result of government regulations, where hospitals have to justify the number of beds they're going to offer. I mean, that's certainly something that ought to
Right.
But it still may be that, relatively freer economies with respect to healthcare, and certainly I'm not trying to make an argument about Medicare for all or anything, but it could be that with respect to epidemics, we may, on average, be a little better prepared because each hospital, wants to have the capacity and are competing, and maybe you end up having a little more capacity that way. So, not the only consideration by far in healthcare, but perhaps something to think about on the margins.
Makes perfect sense. So I want to ask you guys about two hypotheses that I have. One is the tech frontlash hypothesis. People were talking about the tech backlash. Everybody used to love Google and love all of the tech companies. And then over the last couple of years, they got upset at them. The left was upset because they're too big. The right was upset because they're supposedly biased against conservatives. Probably are in some measure in some situations. Query how much. All very interesting. But now, the fact is they are what's making this barely tolerable. First of all, I'm sure we're using a lot of technology in general a lot more and understanding it, but also the underlying technology, whether it's Zoom or it's the backbone or whatever else, these people, and it's a bunch of people, it's the coders, it's the people who do the hardware stuff, totally alien to me. As a former computer programmer, the hardware, I barely understood how it worked, but there are obviously people who keep the infrastructure going. So the result is afterwards, people, if they, setting aside, of course, the amazing human capacity for ingratitude, maybe some people will sort of, the reaction will be, wow, the tech people in the aggregate really saved our butts on this. And the second hypothesis is the inoculation hypothesis, which is this disease, devastating as it is, will help inoculate us against much worse diseases. As best as we can tell, this is going to be 1 to 3% death rate in the population, probably actually less than 1%. It may be 3% death rate among people who get sick, but it's not clear that everybody does. So obviously that's awful, but obviously history shows us that there could be 30%, or in some, obviously in the Americas, could be 80 to 90% death rate from certain kinds of epidemics. So the hope is the one thing that will come out of this in the decades to come is we're going to end up with a much better, I use inoculate metaphorically here, but a public health system that's been inoculated against much worse diseases through its experience, through its creating these analogs to antibodies, so that next time there's something like the bird flu, which is a much higher death rate, but fortunately has a much lower contagion rate, if it's something that combines the high death rate and the high contagion rate, we'll be somewhat more prepared. And we'll say, wow, thank God for coronavirus. Those are my two hypotheses, and I'm happy to see people shoot them down.
I find the first one plausible, and I'm dubious for the second one.
Ah, well, all right.
I mean, there's always the second one has a version of the human capacity to fight the last war hypothesis.
Maybe that's right. Maybe we'll develop the wrong antibodies.
Right, and I guess that means we don't. Maybe we don't yet know whether the popular sentiment once this is all over will be, we handled that well. It was a good thing we listened to the public health professionals and we got through this. And so next time, we'll do what they tell us again. Or that people will say, man, that was a real mess. And imagine to themselves that things would have been better if they'd done it in some other way. So I can just imagine, 2 years from now, if public health officials tell us, before something has gotten bad, you've got to go into quarantine again. People might say, oh, no, we know what happens when we go into quarantine. We don't get out for 6 months and
right.
No jobs and forget it.
Let's just eat, drink, and be merry.
And maybe one relevant data point is the anthrax attacks. Recall that the anthrax attacks back to, I think, 2001 or so, was the motive of those attacks was to some extent to call attention to the dangers of bioterrorism and the like. But I certainly don't have any sense that the anthrax attacks made us different for this, somewhat different, non-man-made attack. It didn't lead us to say, oh, well, we better have a huge national stockpile, and maybe we did maybe California did, for example, for a couple of years, and then they gave up on that. So I think that reaction will be over a short period of time, and maybe if we create some better institutions, that'll help us and help inoculate us, but I'm not holding our breath.
So, sorry to Orin, cut you off. One last, one thing I would love to see grow out of this that I don't think will happen would be for public health to be more focused on externalities. I think, in the sort of post-ACA world, public health has often just meant the provision of healthcare to people, regardless of their externalities or not. And one thing about this current crisis is it's really public health. It's not private health. It's the kind of thing where you really would want government to be able to step in and do it. So if it meant a sort of reordering of our public health infrastructure to really think about externalities, not are people making health choices we don't like, that would be amazing. Sorry.
Antibiotic policy is obviously one where people say, well, there's way too much antibiotics. I think the chance that this leads people to say, oh, we need people not to take antibiotics as much, which would be a very reasonable, thoughtful thing to say based on this. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, and I would just say I share the deep skepticism, if not go beyond it, on the inoculation hypothesis, which strikes me as just, it would be nice if horrible suffering 100,000 or 1 million lives lost is actually in the net something that saves lives, but I don't think we have any reason to think that that's the case. There are all sorts of complicated dynamics here, but I think just it is what it is. I was reading a book on the Spanish flu of 1918, and it just sort of presents this is sort of like the lesson I drew from it is sort of like, welcome to the human condition. These pandemics happen from time to time, and they have for time immemorial, and that's just the nature of things. And you do your best as you can with them, but I don't think you can generally say with it it's a good thing that one hits, or that it sort of helps down the road. I think it's just bad, but it is what it is. On the question of the tech attitudes, I think this situation will change attitudes on so many different issues. I mean, I think it's really a reordering of structure of how people are going to think about sort of everything. And I think tech is among them. I think to the extent people are associating tech with the communications they're having today, and with that, I think that's definitely one. But it's probably more likely to be kind of at the margins, certain businesses rather than others. I don't think people are thinking like, thank God I have my email account, and therefore I look nicely on Gmail, for example. They may be thinking, thank God Amazon exists because I'm getting it to deliver a lot of stuff and I don't have to go out into the dangerous world. So I think it's probably specialized or more specific to the actions. But I think it's just going to change so many attitudes, and that's just one of many.
Great. So let me just mention a few things. One is I've been persuaded that all is for the worst in this, the worst of all possible worlds. So I'm not going to be Pollyannish anymore. Second, Saberdance and Theo Bramophile point out to me that it's apparently inter armas enim silent leges. I feel that is the worst sort of pedantry, which means other people's pedantry, as opposed to my pedantry, which is the best sort of pedantry. And the last thing I want to mention is that the chat, despite the warning, seems to be going very well. Now, maybe that's the sort of thing that brings more people to chat and gets the trolls out to really attack. But I recommend the chat. So there's some interesting questions about things in general, like people point out that, it may be that on balance, there'll be fewer deaths because fewer car accidents, fewer perhaps murders and such. But, I'm wondering what it is that we can add value in. Is there anything that that you guys, my colleagues, my co-bloggers can say that like there's some interesting legal twist that people should be thinking more about? Like some observation. I'll give you an example of something that came up on a list that I started for law professors on law and epidemics. Somebody said, there's an interesting question about how travel for child custody purposes it fits within essential travel rules. Like, how is it, like, it's just not clear. A lot of these things are just done on the spur of the moment. They say essential, and then who knows what's essential and what's not. That's not an answer, that's a question. But if you guys have some answers or some little observation, people are just getting wrong, like Orin, if people are just getting some things wrong about Fourth Amendment and checkpoints, or Will, if people are getting things wrong about state versus federal power balance in this, or Michael, if people are getting things wrong about intellectual property law in this, tell us.
Eugene, I think the time for lawyers will come. It's not quite yet. The time for lawyers is going to come over time once we're past this emergency window where we're just trying to figure out how bad is this, how many people have this, what's the death rate, what can we do to get the most healthcare resources to people. And then we're going to start thinking about, okay, what are the alternatives? What ways can we sort of start reintroducing society and have new rules? And that, I think, is going to raise questions of what will the statutory frameworks be for allowing people to go out in the world, and surveillance questions, and all those questions will come. They're just not quite here yet. And so I think in the short term, our role can be as people who have some public voice, mostly in getting the views of those who are informed about these issues and thoughtful about them. We can kind of boost their signal on the blog, even though it's not something within our expertise. That's something we can do.
So this is not a thing to contribute, but I think the flag is there used to be a lot of epidemic law in constitutional law. I mean, there are quite a few dormant commerce clause cases about quarantines. The very first federal administrative agency was basically a public health agency, the Bureau of Animal Integrity, or it was a post-Civil War sort of animal control bureau dealing with various forms of sort of diseased cattle and so on. It was given incredibly broad powers because the epidemics among livestock were so bad at the time.
Bureau of Animal Industry.
Animal Industry, there we go.
1884, the act was signed by President Chester Arthur.
There's a great book about it, actually, which hopefully the internet will reveal its name, which I'm forgetting at the moment. So there are a bunch of like Supreme Court cases and statutes and precedents about sort of the power of states and federal government to deal with this kind of problem. But they come from a very long time ago. And so I think there will be, as Orin says, a sort of time when lawyers have to come in and suddenly have all these precedents on the one hand seem very on point, but on the other hand come from a different era of constitutional law thinking. And have to decide, which of them apply, and which of them need to be updated, and which, what's going on here. I think that will be later. But I will just say there is a body of epidemic law, and it's 100 years old. So it'll be fun to see what happens when we have to crack it open.
Michael?
Yeah, so I was disappointed when I found out that all the people going outside to clap at 8 o'clock were doing so for the doctors and not the lawyers, because I thought for sure that was they were excited that we were going to help them through the next get through this crisis, but apparently it's the doctors. I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to that law professors or lawyers are going to make a huge difference here, and I'm also skeptical that if we did make a huge difference, it would necessarily be for the better. One thing to think about is what is the effect on our politics, not so much in terms of who wins in November, but polarization and so forth. And from what I've seen so far, it just seems like this is the usual polarization story where everybody kind of finds something to see in this. You can either say, well, the government's incompetent, or you can say that the private markets are uncaring. And so I'm not sure that this really resolves political things. I do think lawyers will largely be helpful in reacting. And certainly I think institutions will be a little bit more aware. I mean, one thing that I was amazed at when I blogged about some of this force majeure issues with college dorms was the contracts didn't really address this. I mean, like, wouldn't you just think of, like, what are all the terrible, I mean, isn't that what you do as a lawyer? Think, like, what are all the terrible things that can happen, and throw clauses into your contract, basically making the clause good in case any of the 10 most terrible things you can imagine happen. And, some contracts do it. We found out that the Major League Baseball players contract basically said, no, national emergency, we're not going to pay you if we don't play any games. So sometimes they're out there, but sometimes they're not. And hopefully lawyers will play some role in thinking a little bit more systematically, not just about epidemics, but other kinds of things that can happen. But in terms of really preventing the next one or really making us better prepared, I'm a little cynical that will make that much of a difference.
You know, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. So I'm trying to see some good questions to finish up on, because we did ask for questions, and there are a lot of good ones. Some of them are kind of technical. Somebody does say that anybody who had dormant commerce clause at 52 after the hour on his bingo card wins. So that's
well done.
So here's the question from Braden Murphy, or anyone else, but it's Will, it's you. Have you given thought to the recent privileges and immunities-based questioning of certain state travel restrictions, such as executive orders that sort of say if you're from the icky state, then you got to quarantine? Which is an interesting point, because usually the general rule is, you know, California can't treat New Yorkers differently from Californians, and certainly not New Yorkers differently from Washingtonians. But here, you know, it does make sense that we say if you're from a state which has a lot of trouble, different than if you're a state which has a little trouble. What do you think, Will? Or is it, one possible answer is, Orin's point is right. This is not the time to pettifog all this, and the political branches will do what they do, and that's probably what they should be doing. And then eventually there may be some lawsuits, but they shouldn't be really focusing on that question.
I think the thing we're most likely to see, and I'm not sure this is the right thing to see, although there's some intuition behind it, is something like a strict scrutiny model for the travel. So if the governor of Texas tried to say, nobody can come from New York at all because New Yorkers are diseased, so I'm just saying, you know, no New Yorkers can come to Texas, I think the courts might well say, well, is that the most narrowly tailored way of effectuating your, you know, compelling interest in public health? No, because a quarantine would accomplish the same thing and be much more tailored. People come, but you have to wait, you know, 14 days, and then you can go out and about. But at the same token, I think that means that something like quarantine would be more likely to be upheld, because the governor could say, look, you know, I'm not telling people they can't come at all. I'm doing the, you know, the least burdensome thing I can that effectuates the public interest. And that would sort of harmonize the right to travel idea with a lot of other constitutional rights. Now, there are always these questions of, you know, which rights get what kind of scrutiny, and how do we decide what kinds of tailoring, and all those things that I think we could pettifog over. But just a sort of a base level intuition, that seems like it's likely how people will handle it.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, it is 58 after, and I'm in LA, and we're supposed to know our showbiz, and the rule of showbiz is you gotta leave them wanting more, rather than leave them thinking that it dragged on too long. So, colleagues, can I ask of our closing statement from each?
Okay, I'll go first because no one else wants to. So I want to say thank you to those of you that have logged in to watch this. I'm looking through the names, and I'm seeing a lot of longtime Volokh conspiracy readers and commenters and friends, and it's pretty cool to have had a community now for like 20 years, almost 20 years. It makes us all feel very old.
Yeah, but exactly. What does that make us if we've been doing it for 20 years?
20 years ago. But it's really cool. And so thank you. And I hope you all stay healthy and safe during this unusual time.
Michael, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I'll echo that. I've only been, of course, I've been a reader of the conspiracy for a long time, an occasional commenter, but I've only been blogging recently, although I think I had a week a long time ago. But I have actually appreciated the comments, and I think the comments are really generally of much higher quality on this blog than on the vast majority of stuff out there.
Well, Michael, that's setting the bar very high.
So thank you all for coming, and thank you for organizing this, Eugene.
Thank you. Will?
We should do this again.
We should do this again. So, folks, let me just say, there are, subtracting the four of us, there are 60 people on. I am just delighted. literally delighted to see you because I am seeing many of you for the first time. I am seeing some of you, Emily, Don, Josh, others whom I already know well. It's been very good. Tell your friends. Tell them. I did this video with the Volokh folks, and it was surprisingly good. Surprisingly good. That has credibility to it. It shows that you were never a sucker for it, but you know, somehow it worked out. I very much hope we're going to have more of this. I want to say, all of you, stay safe and stay healthy. And thank you so much for showing up. And thank you very much, Michael, Will, and Orin, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
The best.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.